Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Unlock the Door Radio here at UCY TV Productions. And I think today you're going to find this a very stimulating subject we're going to deal with. If you're a parent, you're a grandparent, if you plan on being a parent, this is something you really need to focus on. How are we raising our kids? And I'm not talking from kind of that TV fluffy talk show sort of way, but more from a psychological basis. Because I think that to a large degree, what the messages we've been getting the last 30 years has been that, well, you shouldn't work kids too hard, you shouldn't expect too much, and you should be easy on them. And I think what we're seeing is the effects of that. Now, tonight's guest is an expert on this, and he's going to tell you a little bit about himself and just take off. And that's David Eberhardt, who is a psychiatrist, right, David?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And you're coming from Sweden.
Yeah, I'm a psychiatrist. I work in something called Prima, child and adult psychiatry in Stockholm.
Okay. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and then just kind of let us know some of the books that you've done and the basic subject.
Well, as a psychiatrist, I used to be the head of staff of the Stockholm County Emergency Ward in the psychiatry ward that serves the whole Stockholm area. I used to be the head of staff there for 5 years, and during that time, that was about 5 years ago, or at least maybe 7. I had, since I have been working in psychiatry for a very long time, I have seen and thinking a lot about the changes that we see in among especially young people in the way their pattern of seeking help, what they seek help for. So this had been, I had been focusing a lot of that in my work, and then I wrote an article in one of the major Swedish newspapers where I had found, I would say, clinically that we have not only in psychiatry but as a population in whole, we seek more and more security, even though we get more and more safety, even though we really should feel more secure. So we pad the world of ourselves as adults, but in even more so when it comes to our children, which I wrote about, and a publisher in Sweden found that very interesting. So they wanted me to write a book about it, which eventually became a Swedish bestseller called In the Land of the Safety Junkies, or The Land of Security Junkies. It's not translated into English, which I find a pity, especially since it. But the issue here was that the safer we get, as I say, the more security we seek, which people recognize themselves in. So as an example, I was using the concrete example of bicycle helmets, which is of course a stupid or rather naive example, because this is a much more broad issue than just having to do that. We put bicycle helmets on our kids. We pad their world in every possible way. Pamper them from the beginning, and the effects that I found, that I at least did clinically, would say was rather obvious, or is rather obvious, when you see the psychiatric pattern that people are seeking help for things like young people would never have seeken help for that around 30 years ago or 25 years ago. Now they seek help because their girlfriend left them, or their dog died, or their boss are evil or treating them bad in ways that they would never, that they would They would have before not it would not have took them so hard as you can see today. And when I wrote that book, I wrote the follow-up was also a bestseller, which I don't know the exact English version would be something like the original title is "Nobody Takes Shit in the Land of the Easily Offended," which would be in probably another title in English, but it's not all. That is not translated either, and that was basically the same thing that we have seen for the last 10, 20, maybe 20 years, that people are really getting more and more offended, and they are acting out like victims, having ombudsmen taking care of them. Instead of course, people can be very offended also in archaic societies. So it has not only to do with the civilized Western world, but the difference that you can see in people today is that they tend to be not only easily offended, but also acting out as victims. They don't act out. They are passive aggressive rather.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. You've heard the phrase from Nietzsche: "That which does not kill us makes us stronger."
Yeah, of course.
Okay. It seems that is something that we don't want to apply to our kids. We try to soften everything for them. And so what you're saying is that what we do when we soften everything for the children is that we don't prepare them for the real world. And so they go out, and when they do get hit with all of the problems and issues that will hit them in the workplace, in school, in social life, they're not equipped to deal with it then.
Yeah, that is the main message that I do write about in all my book, and I wrote another book about that, but that's more of a psychiatry book for everybody, which called Normal, that I wrote 2011, and then last year I wrote the book How Children Took Power, which is translated into English, but unfortunately not yet published. But this book is about the exact how upbringing makes the way where the children are dictating the upbringing makes them very unprepared for adult life, because obviously it's very hard to tell what is the perfect upbringing. Nobody can really tell that because it's difficult to measure. You have millions of different factors that you need to take into account, and then when do you stop? When are you finished? Nobody knows when. So you have a person that are 25 years old and say, okay, I'm feeling fine, and then you can be almost certain that someone in his or her neighborhood will say, no, he's not fine, he just thinks he's fine. So it's very hard to measure what is the effect of upbringing. So that leaves it to we have a lot of experts, so-called experts, I would say, saying everything about how you should treat your kids, but when it comes to hard facts, when it comes to traits, personality traits and psychiatric illnesses and stuff like that, it's very hard to say that the way you treat your children is really having a huge impact on personality traits or psychiatric illness. But what do have impact is besides genetics and group culture, etc. What do have impact probably is on expectations of life, because that has nothing to do with personality traits, or very little to do with personality traits. So if you sort of pamper your kids to think that everything's going to solve itself from the beginning, and then you can tell when they are teenagers, adolescents and young adults, that they are really disappointed because life wasn't that easy. Like the effect of I'm not saying we should do exactly as Nietzsche said. That's rather extreme, but we have gone a far way from that today.
Yeah, I mean, I can take a look at it this way. I remember, this is an example, maybe can fit this situation here. When I was in physical education, when I was a teenager, I didn't really, when I was in middle school, care that much for going out and doing things. I was somewhat passive in that respect. But then, for some reason, I kind of got the inspiration to do it and get in shape. But the physical education teachers that existed in those days, when you weren't doing your best to be in shape or something like that, they would scream at you. They would grade you down. They were more like drill sergeants. But the thing is, though, it got results.
We had a sergeant in high school.
Yeah, it got results. A lot of people, when the coach went out there, boys and girls, and yelled at them and said, "Come on, pick it up." They didn't just laugh and just kind of do their thing. They started running faster or walking faster.
It's really interesting because I have a lot of kids also. I have 6 kids, and my second youngest kid, he started Taekwondo training. He's 3 years old, and my 7-year-old, he's been training football. Soccer is called in the United States, as you know. For us, football. He's been training that, and his training. If you go to his training, I get really annoyed as a parent because no one of the kids are listening to the trainer. They just run around. Nobody listens, and if someone is not scoring, he gets upset and goes outside of the football pitch and sits outside screaming while his parents are trying to pamper him and say, "Oh, you should come back to the football pitch." But this is the total opposite from the Taekwondo training, which is more of a hierarchic, old-fashioned way of training. Everybody, the 3-year-olds, they have no trouble whatsoever listening to the Taekwondo teacher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
which is really interesting to see, because we always excuse our kids with saying, "Oh, they are just kids. They can't do better." But of course they can. We can have 3-year-olds go to Taekwondo training without no problem whatsoever. They listen to the trainer.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, like I was going to lead up to here, that matches into this. Hell?
Excuse me, I didn't hear that.
Oh, I was going to say that what I was going to bring up here that leads into what you're saying about Taekwondo and soccer is the fact that when I was in high school, of course, the PE teachers and the coaches were, they were in your face to improve. And, some people probably didn't like getting yelled at or whatever, but they did it. And nowadays, if you go to a typical physical education class in the United States, it's more like, well, we don't have to grade them on their accomplishments. It's just their attitude. Did they appreciate the being able to be exposed to modern dance? Or, if you tell them to run around the track, there are those who really care about it. Maybe they're out for sports or something. They go run. But the majority will just kind of walk and just kind of, talk to their friends.
It's the same all over the Western world, I think, at least in the northwest of Europe and northern parts of Europe and the United States. I think this situation is, and the interesting part, you can say you have different ways, and probably, as Donald Winnicott, the psychoanalyst, said, good enough parenting is good enough. So probably it works out well for most kids, either way you do it. But the interesting part is we have some interest, and that's why I wrote all these books also, because we have some quite interesting surveys that has been published lately, the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, that show us one thing that is very obvious is when it comes to Sweden, which have a very pampering style of upbringing, we have lousy results in the PISA studies. I don't know if you're familiar with the PISA studies, which is the comparisons between different schools in the OECD countries. And Swedish school used to be okay, among the best, but it's getting worse and worse. The results, especially for the young boys. The young boys' results in especially mathematics and stuff where you cannot sort of lower the demands are really, really, really bad. And also the only thing that we are really good at in Sweden, if you take that ironically, it is that at the same time as our kids have lousy results in the PISA studies, they do think of themselves that they are better than all the rest. So what we teach our kids, young kids, is they think they are really good, but they really are, objectively are not. And that also, another survey that came out, I think 2011 or 2012, also OECD comparison study, which measured how kids in the OECD countries were feeling. And the interesting thing was that 11-year-olds, the Swedish kids, were the second happiest of all kids in the OECD countries. Only the Finns were happier. So that sounds really, really great. We have really happy kids. The problem is, that, however, that if you look at 13-year-olds, the Swedish kids they're in the middle. And if you look at 15-year-olds in the same survey, the Swedish 15-year-old kids are among the most unhappy kids in the OECD countries. So in 4 years, we are having the upbringing style of we are meeting the kids on their kids' levels. You seek the competent child and stuff like that we always teach our kids here. It makes that we have really happy kids, but we have unhappy teenagers.
Mm-hmm. And I would assume that then means unhappy adults.
Of course. Maybe I'm an optimist. I could say maybe it's like you may, after a while, get, as I said, the personality traits. It's difficult to tamper with the personality traits. They've got their personality traits, and maybe they, after a while, when they have gotten disappointed for 10 years, they may adjust. But we do have young adults that are really unhappy. You can also see that we have most self-harm among young girls. It's rising, even though our suicide rates are falling in all the Western world, which probably has to do with a lot of that we are prescribing so much antidepressant drugs, which may help a lot of them, even though we do prescribe too much and on the wrong indications, but still some of them you prescribe. Sometimes you prescribe it right, so the suicide rates probably falls a little bit because of that, or maybe I would say I think a lot because of that. But on the same time, even though we have falling suicide rates, we do have an epidemic of self-harm behavior, and that you also see in the United States, you see it in Great Britain, you see it in parts of Western world, but it's really extreme in the countries where we have a sort of upbringing that is totally the opposite way of bringing up kids from historically that you have seen all around the world, because nobody has brought up kids like we do before. And the interesting thing is that we do think, I'm not saying that it's wrong, I'm saying we do not know. We do not know whether our way of bringing up kids are better than our grandparents, because the only evidence we have of saying that we bring up kids better than our grandparents are our so-called experts saying that we now know that it's better to bring up kids the way we do rather than people used to do 100 years ago. But they have no clue because they didn't live 100 years ago. They've never done one research on it.
Mm-hmm. Has there been any research where you've taken a look at people that might be being in a culture? I would be thinking something like Eastern Europe, where there are more demands put on the kids, but then see if the same levels of depression and anxiety exist in those cultures.
That's an interesting. You can say that suicide rates are really high in the Baltic countries. They're really high in Hungary, and they are quite high. But it's also like when it comes to that. Studies are difficult. You can use them as a hint, but people tend to have very far-fetched conclusions from those kind of studies. Even saying that, one interesting thing that I do write about in my book, How Children Took Power, is that the way with the rebellion kid that do not tend to honor their father and mother or father. We do not see those kind of kids in the same way in the Eastern Asia or Middle East or even the southern part of Europe, where we have maybe a little bit more conservative ways of upbringing that compared at least to the Scandinavian countries, where we have kids that do not respect their parents. And I don't know if that's also people. I'm pretty much saying that people must be allowed to bring up the kids the way they want. If they want to have a democratic way of discussing everything and letting the kids decide where to go on vacation, what to eat, what kind of clothes they should wear, whether they should or should not play football during their whatever. If you want that, that's probably fine. But I do not think that you get kids that love you more by doing that. And if that's the purpose of upbringing, I'm not saying that should be the purpose of upbringing, but if you find that very, very the meaningful way of bringing up a kid, your kid should respect you and honor you and take care of you when you get older and on your deathbed. Then probably the way we bring up our kids is not the best.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying I know this. I'm just saying look around, and I'm not totally convinced. And saying that is just a way of saying that. Again, we need to bear in mind that we have a lot of experts saying a lot of things about how we should bring up our kids, like Dr. Spock or Penelope Leach or people that are well known all over the world, but they do not have a clue. They just think. It's just ideology. It has nothing to do with science.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is pertinent, but I have talked to people from Finland. And just to give viewers a little bit of, listeners, I should say, a little bit of background, just a slight amount. Finland generally scores right up there with Singapore and China when it comes to academic achievement, especially in
Korea.
Yeah, in Korea when it comes to mathematics, science, and so forth. They're, I've wondered, because they have somewhat of a more flexible sort of almost what you could call a humanistic approach to education. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about that, but it's more of it just seems to me it's more Montessorian or Piagetian or whatever. But the thing is that people I've talked to from Finland, what they stress if they're comparing Sweden is that the parents expect more of the kids. they will actually sit down with them when they're really young and say, we're going to study here together. We're going to read a book together. And they demand more manners. I've seen many cases where an exasperated mother will first start reasoning with a 4-year-old on a train, and then it turns into shouting at him or her because the 4-year-old just doesn't stop doing what they're doing. Versus, from at least my understanding is that in Finland it's a little bit more conservative. It's not as I don't know how you would term it in Sweden, but it's a more conservative way of dealing with the parent-child relationship when they're really young. It's hard to get kids to sit down and do extra studies when the culture says, no, you're overdoing it. You shouldn't be using your child's free time to be trying to give them stuff. Let the school do that, but don't you do it. Have you noticed that, or am I just being?
I think that's a correct observation. And Finland is as you mentioned, really doing well in many ways. But what is interesting is the thing you say, that in Sweden we have a lot of focus from the Danish psychotherapist Jesper Juul, which is he's really famous in all of Europe actually, because he's preaching about the competent child, that you should reason with a 2-year-old and so. But I think in Finland he has not that much impact. Where you have a more conservative way of saying you are not afraid of social upbringing. You should have manners at tables. You should, when you go to a restaurant, you behave, blah blah blah, things like that. And this is interesting in another way, because we have countries that are very close to each other. Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and we have totally different cultures, which is interesting when it comes to upbringing. I write a lot about that in my book, How Children Took Power. That what do have impact on the way we think and our personality traits, more than what your parents are teaching you, is actually what kind of culture you are living in. And I'm not the only one who has been written about that, obviously, because there's done a lot of research in this, which is really interesting. Because in Finland you have succeeded to have a sort of a maybe more humanistic way of upbringing, but still, on the same time, you have not the lack of demand culture that we have in Sweden. Sweden is not only when it comes to upbringing, but when it comes to everything. We are really afraid of putting demands on our citizens and children.
Yeah, which is that? You think that's part of the prevailing socialists?
No, I don't hear you.
Oh, do you think that has something to do with socialism, or is it more of a humanistic approach, feeling like, well, we've got to be nice, and if you're nice, then the person will be nice back to you?
I think it's both, because it's not an isolated phenomenon. It's not only Sweden where you see this. You can see this also I think you see it in America in different ways, and I do think you see this in the UK and other countries which has not been like state socialist countries like Sweden have been.
Okay, now.
But still, of course, we have been living in a country where society takes over the family in a very very obvious way. That we are when it comes to, I don't know if you're familiar with the World Values Survey, which is Excuse me?
Please go on. Let's hear about this.
World Values Surveys, they have been doing this for several years. You can check it on the internet. It's really easy to find. And Sweden, you compare values of the inhabitants in different countries. And Sweden is extreme country in World Values Survey. We are the least traditional country in the world with least traditional values. We are the least authoritarian country in the world with authoritarian values. We are the most secular country in the world, and we are also the most the country with self-fulfillment strategies. We do not have any survival strategies. We all we have the values that all the inhabitants want to fulfill themselves, which is really interesting, because we have no survival strategies left. And probably that has to do also with which people in Sweden at least say, we haven't been in a war for 200 years. So we don't need to survive. And when you don't need to survive, and that is why I say you see this in the whole Western world, but Sweden is sort of the role model for the rest, because it seems like this is really a great country. But I'm saying you should be aware not to become like Sweden, because Sweden has some there's fine parts of Sweden, of course, fine things about the Swedish culture, but this is not this. You don't want to import this in other Western countries, and you are getting next. You are the ones to get next. I went to the United States. I'm not saying only the United States, but the neighbors of Sweden and the northwest of Europe and the United States, Canada, countries like that, are the ones that are mimicking Sweden, because it's always so. You read surveys. Oh, Sweden is so, they are so happy in Sweden. Blah blah blah. But this is coming. We are exporting this. Well, the safety junkie syndrome is one of the most globalized syndromes in the world, because fear travels faster than reason.
Yeah. The sad part about America, though, is there are some aspects of Sweden that are somewhat at least empowering, because, like, for instance, parents will let their 10-year-olds, if they want to go see a movie, go take the local train and go into Stockholm, watch the movie, and be home like by 9 o'clock in the evening. In the United States, on the other hand, the danger of importing this is that there's more of a fear culture and also a punishment culture within the United States. And now I keep seeing these reports that come across news that, a parent recently, and this is not an isolated incident, a parent recently, she was watching her child through the kitchen window, only like about 100 meters across the street, in a park bench, and she was watching, I guess, while she was doing the dishes or something like this.
Yeah.
And a neighbor brings the kid over and says, "Oh, I was protecting your child. He was alone. He was like 6, 7 years old." Yeah, and then the police come and pay a visit, and then the social services. The advantage this person had was she was well connected, so she got this out into the public eye. But it's almost like a lot of police now are saying, well, you cannot let your kid even play in your front yard without an adult watching them.
That's why you should get my book translated, In the Land of the Safety Junkies, because you are also, in the United States is a land of safety junkies, but in another way than we have in Sweden. And I also wrote about this in How Children Took Power, especially focused on the the American way of pampering your kids. In Sweden and Scandinavian countries, we have the sort of emotional pampering. We do not dare to shout at our kids or do not say anything bad to them. But maybe when it comes to these issues, that the fear of pedophiles, the fear of something happening to the kids, it's even worse in the United States than it is in Scandinavian countries. And in Scandinavian countries, we have this a lot as well, but not as much as in the United States, where you have like the state of, I don't know, remember Georgia or some state in America where you had some, not the legislation, but they had sort of a ruling that said you should not leave your 12-year-old alone at home, which is would never happen in Sweden, that you couldn't leave a 12-year-old alone.
A 12-year-old can babysit in Sweden.
A 12-year-old can babysit. A 12-year-old is nearly adult.
Uh-huh. Well, on that respect, I mean, yes, there is a little bit more freedom when it comes to a child maybe has a relative living in another country. That child can fly on the airplane if they're 12 or 13 and go meet the relative. Whereas in the United States, I mean, it'd be like, that's a big no-no. You would never send a, you know.
I was 10 when I went to the United States and met my second cousins for the first time alone.
Wow.
And I changed planes on the way as well.
You know, the sad part is, though, that I read a statistic that said that more children each year in the United States drown as a result of their mothers leaving, or fathers, I don't know, but leaving mop buckets unattended in the house. I mean, it was something like 70 or 80 kids a year, you know, when they're like toddlers, will crawl into the bucket and then go in head first and drown. And that's way more than are abducted by strangers and killed.
Yeah. But and also another interesting or at least very, very clear-cut statistic is that there's much more danger being abused by a pedophile in your home than outside.
Yeah.
Because most pedophiles, they know the perpetrator. The kids know the perpetrator.
Mm-hmm. Now I want to ask.
You if you hear that, then you start as a safety junkie who say, oh, nobody should be alone with their kids, which is another problem which you have in daycare centers in Sweden, and even more so in the United States, that you have a legislation saying nobody could be alone with the kids. And I think in the United States, when I went to California, they had a legislation saying that no kid could be alone in a room at any time in one room inside the daycare center.
Wow. Okay. Well, talk about, you know, creating a paranoia there. Hey.
That's parenting. Yeah, it's paranoid parenting. Mm-hmm. Like Frank Furedi, the sociologist, wrote the book. Really interesting book.
You know, now here's an interesting thing. You said you have 6 kids, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And I have a large family too, and I know people that have large families. And I'm wondering, I've talked to a lot of people who feel that it's selfish to have more than one kid, or maybe 2 at the outset, because they feel that they need to buy lots of stuff for the kid. They need to be able to afford all the new iPhones and the really nice TV, their own room, all kinds of this and this and this. But I'm wondering, going back to like the birth order studies and things of Alfred Adler, it seems that buying all this stuff is not creating happiness for the child. And in some ways, I mean, when, you know, my kids know that they don't get as much of those kinds of things because there's other kids in the family, but they also have a social network that they know they'll have for the rest of their lives through their brothers and sisters.
You can't buy happiness. I think the Beatles, they wrote about that.
And I'm wondering if this pampering thing...
Oh, that about happiness? No, what was it? You can't buy me love. No, whatever.
It's kind of the same thing, I think.
Kind of the same thing, yes.
But if we think about it, I'm wondering if the whole thing, when we're looking at these suicidal birth rates in countries such as Sweden and much of the rest of Europe, that some of that is, or if not most of it's, based on 2 things. One is people feel guilty for not being able to get all of the fancy stuff that's advertised on TV for their kids, and 2 is we're not preparing young people to take responsibility. A lot of male kids in Sweden are 35 years old and still living with their mom, and they've never had a long-term relationship.
That's really true. It's really sad. I can't comment that more than that, but that's I agree on that. This is. But the problem is, if you think that happiness lies in buying a lot of material stuff, you have no evidence for that in happiness studies. You get more happy when you come from underdeveloped countries on a certain level, and you raise yourself from extreme poverty until you get a little bit less impoverished. But when it comes to the developed world, you have no correlation whatsoever. So if that would be the reason why people are not getting kids, I think they should reconsider. Unfortunately, I'm not, when I think about it more, I'm not so sure that's the only reason. At least there's a lot of reasons why people are not getting enough kids. I think one of them is that we are so extremely focused on self-fulfillment, and self-fulfillment is at least in a lot of Western countries, it's totally the same. It's the same as getting the best job, and not being the best mother or being the best father. But I myself, I come from a large family. We are five siblings, and I find it the best thing you can give to your kid is a brother or sister, if that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, I did notice it came out. I know you can't go by these happiness indexes, as being scientific, but it did.
No,
there was
no,
one
obviously not.
Right, but there was one that came out just recently. I think it was talking about life satisfied with life and content, and it said that Utah in the United States scored higher than any other state. And
the Mormons.
Yeah, it's a Mormon state, but also the birth rate's the highest in the United States Utah.
Because of the Mormons. They have a lot of kids, the Mormons, don't they?
Yes.
Traditionally.
Yeah, and those kids are probably not getting as much as kids might in Sweden if there's only one or two kids in the family, but it seems they seem to be, I'm using Utah as an example because then we're using a developed area compared to a developed area, and they seem to be quite happy.
Yeah. I would say, as you said, this is not science, but on the other hand, you have no science contradicting that either.
Yeah. What do you think? There's a researcher. His name was Robert Epstein, and he's written a lot about adolescence being pushed and so forth. And do you think we'd be better off if we started, basically starting from a very young age, but at least our teenagers, we should expect more of them.
I think you should start earlier. I think the problem is that we expect, like our smallest kids. My youngest kid, he's 1.5. He can say thank you after dinner. He shakes our hand, and he has major problems with his upbringing. But when it comes to these we put quite high demands on. We are nice. We don't push him that hard, but still we say you should say thank you. And his big brothers and big sisters, they're saying thank you, taking hands. They take off the dishes, etc. And he tries taking off the dish. So you can start. I think what you should do, I think there's a major problem if you do not do this in the beginning. It gets very difficult, and I think that is one key issue to why Swedish kids are feeling so unhappy, is because we have a school system where you have no demands on the, and you have a culture on a whole where you have no demands whatsoever on small kids, but you do have demands also in Sweden on teenagers, especially the demand that you should be older than you may I think in many countries a teenager still is a kid, but in Sweden a teenager, when it comes to debating, they get to be up long hours. They are treated as adults. They discuss things like if they're adults, but they're actually like kids when it comes to responsibilities. I think if you started putting the responsibilities on them from a much lower age, without being mean, you can be very nice to a kid, saying, this is the rules we have in this house. You should take off your, like, mother and father decide what clothing you have, but you decide this. You have to help us with doing this, and this, which applies, like in Sweden, if I eat a chocolate bar in Sweden, the kids should always have the chocolate bar. I've never understood that. It's like you don't have to apply the same rules to adults as you do to kids, because the problem we have in Sweden is we have a culture where we are best friends with our kids all the time, and they get disappointed when their best friends are getting. They need their own best friends. They don't need their parents as best friends. What we do need, what children do need, are parents that are acting out like parents and setting rules and boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what do you think of the idea of really? I mean, I've known families from England who will, during the summer, they put their kids in extra training and so forth, because they want the kids to be at the same level in math as in England. And it seems that this is something that is not, the accelerated learning at home is not something that's part of the Swedish culture.
I think the Swedish culture, we talked about the Finnish culture, where you had a sort of a culture where it's cool to be educated. I've written a lot about that when it comes to the Swedish culture, where it's cool. I did forget earlier on what we were good at in the PISA study. We were really except being our kids in Sweden, they are really good at overestimating their own talents, as I said. But also, what we are really good at in Sweden, sarcastically good at, is getting late to school, missing classes, doing graffiti on schoolyard, etc., ruining everything. So that we have the highest figures in the PISA study of our kids behaving ill-behaved in school, which also shows that you are. I think the culture among kids must be that if you have a culture where you have a sort of, it's fine to develop, it's fine to be educated, then you will have that the kids they influence each other in this. But if you have a culture like in Sweden compared to Finland, where you have the culture that I just mentioned, but in Sweden we have a rock and roll culture. It's cool to trash the hotel rooms. And this has a huge impact on the way our kids are behaving, obviously.
Well, I'm just thinking, last year I heard, my wife loves to tune into the Nobel Prize ceremonies and stuff. And they were interviewing a man who'd won the Nobel Prize. I think could have been economics. I don't know. But anyway, he said that in Israel, when he was growing up, there is a culture there, like you said, there's a culture of everyone contributes to the learning of the child, that it's not just mom and dad who are encouraging you to learn, it is the community, it is your extended family and so forth. And so the children learn that there is a real value in knowledge and knowing things and exploring. And this may be why Israel does so well. And there's always a lot of Nobel Prize winners coming out of Israel.
There's an extreme overrepresentation of Israeli Nobel Prizes.
Mm-hmm.
of people originating from the same culture.
Yeah, I remember one time in a classroom years ago where a student, she said, we only need to learn what we have to learn. And I think that has to be broken. You have to create a culture where the kids see that learning is a vehicle, especially, I mean, we have a few minutes left here. I mean, we're going to a globalistic society. I mean, the kids growing up in Stockholm or Newark, New Jersey, or Bakersfield, California, they're not just competing with their neighbors anymore like they were 20 years ago. They're now competing with people from India, China, Russia, Brazil, and so forth. And that's kind of worries me in that respect.
Yeah, we have a lecturer in Sweden. He goes all over Sweden to have talks about this. How we do need to change focus on what is important, because if we are in the Western world as a whole, if we are will survive. Because if we don't have that, they have that in China, they have that in Korea, they have that in India, and we are the only reason why the Western world is in forefront today is that we were better off from the beginning, so we have a head start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we're kind of living off. It's almost like
we're living from the 19th century. In Sweden, we lived from the 19th century. We have the huge companies from the 19th century that still are the main skeleton of the Swedish economy. And maybe with some new high-tech companies. And that is also the way people are saying, but look at Sweden. Sweden is so creative. We have so creative kids because we invented Skype and we invented Spotify and stuff like that. Yeah, but still, these were individuals. You always have fine individuals, creative individuals. It doesn't say that all of the Swedish system is good just because someone invented Skype.
Yeah. Hey, in the last we have about 1 minute here. It's been excellent. I've loved this conversation. Where can people? You have a website people can go to and get information. In English too.
Not so much in English. I will try if people get there and they write something in the comment field. I'll try to write more in English. It's www.davideberhard.se or trygghetsnarkoman.se, but that's too difficult. But it's the same website.
Yeah, I would say if you have articles there, people could just simply Google translate them.
Yeah, probably, and it gets nearly right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, I think your message.
But it's getting better and better, Google Translate. So
it is. I use it for newspaper articles. It's really good, but
it's getting much better. Yes.
Yes, and I just think you have the message you got there is something that, especially like you said, the United States has to hear this. I mean, they really do.
They really do.
Because I think in Sweden there is a certain common sense that people have that, you'll still let your kid play outside without the parent watching them. But that common sense factor is negated by the punishment factor that exists in the United States. And then you kind of get the worst of all combinations there.
Yeah, I think I really wrote, my first books were written when I wrote them, I thought about Sweden, but when I wrote How Children Took Power, in very many ways I did think about the United States, and most of the literature, the references are American and English.
Okay, well, great. Well, I hope
references.
People, they can just look up your work, David Eberhard, and or your website. And I really encourage people to do so. So anyway, thank you very much for giving us some time tonight.
Thank you.
Okay. You take care now. And Again, listening audience, I encourage you to be back again next week for another episode of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV.